When Henry III ascended the English throne as a child in 1216, few could have predicted that his reign would stretch over 5 tumultuous decades, weaving together threads of deep religious devotion, architectural grandeur, and political strife. Often overshadowed by the warrior kings who came before and after him, Henry was not a conqueror or a master strategist, but he was a visionary in his own right. His unshakable faith shaped not only the spiritual life of the realm, but also its physical landscape, most notably in the majestic rebuilding of Westminster Abbey. Yet beneath this devout exterior lay a reign fraught with internal conflict, baronial rebellion, and the slow, painful birth of constitutional governance. His legacy, though complex and contested, would leave an indelible mark on England's monarchy and its future. In the long, intricate tapestry of England's monarchy, the figure of King Henry III often stands apart, more a man of the altar than of the battlefield, more drawn to prayer and saints than to statecraft and strategy. Reigning from 1216 until his death in 1272, Henry held the throne for 56 years, making him the longest-reigning English monarch before the modern era. Yet despite this impressive longevity, his rule is not widely remembered for glory or conquest, but rather for religious devotion, architectural patronage, and a complicated legacy of political instability. This documentary delves into the fascinating contradictions of Henry III, a king who was deeply pious and spiritually inclined, yet who struggled to assert authority in a kingdom still reeling from civil war and baronial unrest. He was a monarch whose vision of kingship was rooted not in domination but in sanctity, a vision that endeared him to the church but alienated many of his powerful subjects. When Henry inherited the crown at just 9 years old, the kingdom was in a state of near collapse. His father, King John, had died amidst the chaos of the First Barons' War, a brutal conflict born out of rebellion against John's authoritarian rule and his repudiation of the Magna Carta. England itself was a fractured realm, partially occupied by Prince Louis of France, who had been invited by disaffected barons to claim the English throne. The child king's rule began not with a coronation in Westminster, but in the rushed, pragmatic setting of Gloucester Abbey, under the watchful eyes of William Marshal, the revered regent who kept the fragile crown from falling apart. From the outset, Henry's monarchy was shaped by the need to negotiate, to pacify, and to recover. As he matured and took personal control of the throne in 1227, Henry brought with him a personality markedly different from his father's. He was not a tyrant, nor a warrior king. He was a man shaped by monastic influences and religious awe. Throughout his life, Henry was deeply committed to Christian ideals, aligning himself not just as a ruler chosen by God, but as a servant to the divine will. This was not mere political theater. His devotions were sincere and constant. He attended Mass regularly, fasted diligently, gave generously to the Church, and saw in saints and relics the power to shape his reign. His favorite saint was Edward the Confessor, a previous English king canonized for his purity and piety. Henry admired Edward so much that he rebuilt Westminster Abbey as a shrine to him, placing it at the spiritual heart of his kingdom. It was in this sacred space that Henry hoped to define his legacy, one built on faith, reverence, and divine favor. However, piety alone does not make for effective kingship, and it is here that the paradox of Henry III becomes most striking. While he was beloved by the Church and devout in personal conduct, his political decisions were often naive, short-sighted, or heavily influenced by favoritism. His generosity to foreign courtiers, including his Lusignan half-brothers from France, alienated the English nobility. His reliance on papal support and constant financial donations to Rome drained the royal treasury. The king's religious aspirations led him to impose taxes and demand levies that fueled baronial anger. To many of his subjects, Henry was not a saintly protector of the realm, but an ineffective ruler who failed to defend the interests of England in both domestic and foreign affairs. These weaknesses would lead to repeated confrontations with the barons, most notably in the form of the Provisions of Oxford in 1258, which sought to limit the king's authority and establish a council of nobles to guide royal decisions. What followed was a period of constitutional experimentation and civil strife, culminating in the Second Barons' War led by Simon de Montfort. For a brief moment, it seemed that the power of the monarchy might permanently shift towards parliamentary governance. And yet, even in this era of rising baronial power and popular discontent, Henry never ceased to identify himself as a sacred monarch, divinely appointed and morally upright. His religious legacy, however, cannot be dismissed as mere posturing. Under Henry's reign, England saw an extraordinary flowering of ecclesiastical art and architecture. The Gothic transformation of Westminster Abbey, inspired by the great cathedrals of France, remains one of the most important contributions to English cultural and religious life. His patronage extended to monastic houses, friaries, and universities, reflecting not only a love of beauty and grandeur, but a sincere desire to elevate the spiritual life of the kingdom. For Henry, religious faith was not confined to the chapel. It infused his entire conception of kingship. He saw his rule as part of a divine mission, one that mirrored the heavenly order and sought to harmonize earthly governance with spiritual purpose. And yet, history often views Henry with mixed judgment. His reign is not associated with military victory or political reform, but with prolonged instability, costly endeavors, and a monarchy that seemed unable to fully regain the authority lost in the years following King John. His son, Edward I, would later restore royal power through military might and administrative reform, but Henry's own style was more pastoral than political, more ceremonial than strategic. He governed with a sense of personal holiness, even as that very sense made him blind to the realities of power dynamics around him. This documentary aims to explore these contrasts in depth. The boy king turned pious ruler, the architectural patron with a fragile grip on the nobility, the devout servant of God whose earthly realm was fraught with conflict and complaint. Was Henry III merely a weak king enthralled by religion, or was he a visionary monarch whose spiritual idealism left an enduring mark on the fabric of English history? By examining his personal character, religious devotion, relationships with the church and nobility, and his architectural and cultural legacy, we aim to uncover the full complexity of a monarch who defies easy categorization. In doing so, we seek to understand how Henry III's reign helped shape the evolution of the English monarchy, not just in power, but in purpose. In the autumn of 1207, a child was born into the troubled and stormy reign of King John of England. This child, Henry, was the son of John and Isabella of Angoulême, and he would come to wear the English crown at a time of profound national crisis. Born on October 1st at Winchester Castle, Henry's early years were anything but ordinary, shaped by courtly privilege, but also overshadowed by his father's mounting conflicts with the English barons and the church. King John's reign had been marked by fierce disputes, failed military campaigns, and deepening political unrest, culminating in the crisis that would eventually give birth to Magna Carta. Henry, growing up in this fractured and restless environment, had little reason to expect a stable or secure future, let alone one that involved the crown. By the time Henry was just 9 years old, the kingdom had plunged into the First Barons' War. This was a bitter civil conflict sparked by John's refusal to uphold the terms of the Magna Carta, a document reluctantly signed in 1215 that sought to limit royal power and protect baronial rights. The barons, enraged by the king's tyrannical style of rule and his inability to govern justly, turned to Prince Louis of France, the son of King Philip II, and invited him to take the English throne. In May 1216, Louis landed in Kent with a force of French knights and baronial supporters. England was descending into chaos. The authority of the crown was disintegrating, and John, unable to contain the rebellion, took to a frantic campaign trail that ended abruptly with his death in October of the same year. John's death left a throne without an adult heir, and it was in this moment of deep uncertainty that the 9-year-old Henry was thrust into power. He was not crowned in the traditional seat of English kings, Westminster Abbey, but rather in the more secure surroundings of Gloucester Abbey. There was no time for grandeur or tradition. England needed a king, and quickly. The crown used in the ceremony was not even the official royal one, which had been lost during John's flight across the Wash. Instead, a makeshift diadem was hastily fashioned for the boy king's head. The image of Henry's coronation, young, nervous, surrounded by older men who were effectively in charge, serves as a powerful symbol of a kingdom trying to hold itself together while on the verge of collapse. The true power in those first crucial years of Henry's reign did not lie with the boy himself, but with his protector and regent William Marshal. Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, was already in his 70s, a veteran knight with a storied past who had served 5 kings. His reputation for loyalty and military prowess was unmatched, and it was thanks to him that many barons were persuaded to switch their allegiance from Louis back to the young Henry. William's leadership was defined by pragmatism and a deep sense of duty. He saw in Henry not just a fragile child, but the last hope for the Plantagenet line and the future stability of the realm. Marshall's regency was marked by careful diplomacy and effective use of military force, and his guidance was essential in weathering the storm that threatened to overwhelm the English crown. One of Marshall's first and most important actions was the reissue of Magna Carta in Henry's name in 1216, and again in 1217, each time slightly revised to suit the political realities of the moment. This reissuing was more than symbolic, it was a concrete gesture of peace and reconciliation, showing the barons that the new regime would not mirror John's oppressive rule. At the same time, Marshall led loyalist forces against the French invaders and rebel barons in a series of battles that helped to reclaim English territory and morale. The most decisive of these was the Battle of Lincoln in May 1217, where Royalist forces achieved a critical victory over Louis's troops. This was followed by a naval success at the Battle of Sandwich, which cut off French reinforcements. Together, these victories broke the back of Louis's campaign and reasserted royal control over much of the kingdom. These military and diplomatic efforts culminated in the Treaty of Lambeth in September 1217. The treaty marked the end of the First Barons' War and the expulsion of Prince Louis from English soil. In return for his withdrawal and a symbolic gesture of apology, Louis received a small payment and an agreement not to harass his former allies in England. The treaty was not just a diplomatic achievement, it was a pivotal moment in ensuring the survival of the young king's reign. With the foreign threat neutralized and most of the rebellious barons now reconciled, the regency could finally begin the slow and painful process of stabilizing the realm. However, the challenges did not end with peace. Henry was still only a child, and the regency had to govern on his behalf, navigating internal divisions, financial strain, and the ever-present risk of renewed rebellion. William Marshall continued to act as regent until his death in 1219, after which the reins of power passed to a council dominated by Hubert de Burgh and the papal legate, Pandulf. Their leadership, though less charismatic than Marshall's, maintained the essential work of governance and reconstruction. The English Church, particularly under the guidance of Archbishop Stephen Langton and later Edmund of Abingdon, played a crucial role in legitimizing Henry's reign and reinforcing his image as a divinely sanctioned monarch. Throughout this regency period, efforts were made to restore royal authority, repair war-damaged lands, and ensure loyalty among the barons. Castles were fortified, royal justices were reintroduced to oversee law and order, and administrative reforms sought to rebuild the machinery of government. All of this occurred in the name of a monarch who was still learning how to read and write, still growing under the care of his mother and tutors. As he aged, Henry began to assume more ceremonial roles in court and church, gradually being prepared for the eventual transition to personal rule. By the time Henry declared himself of age and took direct control of government in 1227, he had already spent more than a decade as king. Unlike many monarchs who rise to power amid triumph or inheritance in peace, Henry's journey to kingship was forged in crisis. He had survived war, regency, and diplomatic uncertainty, emerging not as a hardened warrior or clever politician, but as a young man profoundly shaped by those who had governed in his name. The trials of his boyhood reign left deep marks, not just on the structure of English governance, but on Henry's personal identity as a ruler. He came to see the king's role as not only a political office, but a sacred trust, a vision infused with the religious influences. This formative period laid the foundation for Henry's later reign. His attachment to the church, his belief in the divine right of kingship, and his tendency to view governance through the lens of moral and spiritual responsibility rather than through calculation or military strength. He inherited a throne in ruins and spent his earliest years watching others rebuild it for him. And though his reign would later be marked by political missteps and contentious relations with the barons, his path to power, rooted in crisis, recovery, and regency, was one of the most extraordinary ascensions in English royal history. The boy king had survived the storm, but the challenges of kingship were only beginning. In 1227, at the age of 20, Henry III declared himself of age and assumed personal control over the English kingdom. Until that point, his rule had been in name only, administered by regents and advisors who had governed since his childhood ascension to the throne during the First Barons' War. The transition from minority rule to personal monarchy marked a significant shift, not merely in who held authority, but in how the monarchy would define itself in a kingdom still recovering from internal war, baronial rebellion, and foreign intervention. For Henry, the act of assuming control was not only legal but symbolic, signaling the emergence of a monarch determined to establish his presence, values, and authority over a deeply divided and fragile nation. The early years of Henry's personal rule were fraught with complex political tensions. England was not a kingdom at peace with itself, and the crown's authority, though restored in theory, remained precarious in practice. Many powerful barons were still skeptical of royal power and eager to protect the liberties they had won during the Regency. The Magna Carta had been reissued multiple times, and though its immediate pressures had receded, its spirit of limiting monarchical power still loomed over the royal court. Henry faced the daunting task of governing a land where loyalty was conditional and where the memories of civil war remained fresh. At the center of Henry's government was Hubert de Burgh, a nobleman and soldier who had served with distinction under King John and William Marshal. Hubert had played a pivotal role during the Regency, particularly in the military victories against Prince Louis of France. His success and loyalty earned him the position of justiciar, making him effectively the king's chief minister. When Henry came of age, Hubert continued to serve as his closest advisor, helping him navigate the complexities of kingship. Initially, this relationship appeared stable. Hubert had experience, political acumen, and a loyal base among the nobility. Yet as Henry matured, he began to chafe under the constraints of such a dominant advisor. The young king sought to assert his independence and to craft a personal rule free from the shadows of regents and protectors. Henry's sense of royal authority was shaped not by conquest or martial glory, but by a deeply held conviction in the sanctity of kingship. He believed in divine right, in the spiritual and moral responsibilities of the crown, and in the ceremonial and symbolic power of monarchy. His model of kingship was less influenced by the aggressive, warlike traditions of his Plantagenet predecessors, and more by continental ideas of Christian kingship. This worldview often put him at odds with the practical needs of governance in a land still riven by baronial power. Whereas earlier kings might have sought to dominate the nobility through force or legal manipulation, Henry leaned toward diplomacy, patronage, and religious legitimacy. One of Henry's earliest tests came not from foreign threat, but from within his own court. The concentration of power in the hands of Hubert de Burgh created friction among other noble families who felt excluded from influence. Chief among these rivals was Peter de Roches, Bishop of Winchester, a French-born cleric who had served under King John and had ambitions to reassert himself at court. Des Roches brought with him a cohort of Poitevin and Savoyard allies, foreign-born nobles who would later be deeply resented by the English aristocracy. These rival factions, Hubert's conservative English loyalists and Des Roches's continental newcomers, created a court marked by intrigue, shifting alliances, and political gamesmanship. In 1232, after years of growing tension, Henry dismissed Hubert de Burgh in a move that shocked the political establishment. Hubert was accused of various abuses of power and financial misconduct, though the charges were likely exaggerated or politically motivated. His fall from grace was a turning point in Henry's reign. While it signaled the king's determination to rule in his own right, it also exposed him to accusations of weakness and manipulation. Many saw Henry as a monarch easily swayed by flatterers and foreign influences, a perception that would dog him throughout his reign. Following Hubert's dismissal, Peter de Roches and his allies gained ascendancy at court. This period saw a significant influx of foreign influence, particularly from Poitou and Savoy, regions tied to Henry's family by marriage and blood. In 1236, Henry married Eleanor of Provence, whose relatives soon filled key positions in the royal household. Though the queen herself was generally admired for her grace and piety, the favoritism shown to her relatives further strained Henry's relations with the English barons. To many of them, it seemed as though the king was surrounding himself with outsiders who held disproportionate power and wealth at the expense of native lords. Despite the political instability, Henry worked diligently to cultivate a kingly image rooted in piety, justice, and religious devotion. He poured resources into religious foundations, particularly monastic orders and cathedrals. Westminster Abbey became a centerpiece of his spiritual and architectural ambitions. He would later rebuild it in the Gothic style as a shrine to Edward the Confessor, the saint king whom Henry idolized. These efforts were not just acts of personal devotion, but deliberate strategies to craft an image of sanctified kingship, one that elevated moral authority above military conquest or political cunning. Still, this idealistic vision of monarchy often clashed with the practical demands of ruling a feudal kingdom. The barons expected a king who could defend their interests, enforce justice, and manage royal finances responsibly. Yet Henry's court was frequently accused of extravagance, favoritism, and mismanagement. He was generous to a fault, often lavishing gifts and offices on favorites, and his fiscal policies, particularly the imposition of tallages and other non-consensual levies, were deeply unpopular. Attempts to raise funds through foreign alliances, such as seeking the Sicilian crown for his son Edmund, only worsened his reputation for political naivete. Throughout the 1230s and 1240s, England was caught in a cycle of uneasy calm punctuated by bursts of baronial frustration. Henry's reliance on foreign favorites and his perceived neglect of English baronial interests eroded his political capital. While he was not a tyrant in the mold of his father, John, he lacked the strategic skill to manage competing factions and often underestimated the political costs of his decisions. Local grievances, disputes over land and justice, and the broader concern over the erosion of Magna Carta's principles all simmered beneath the surface. Despite these problems, Henry maintained a strong commitment to the idea of moral kingship. He sought to embody the Christian virtues of mercy, humility, and righteousness, often acting as a patron of the arts and letters. His court attracted chroniclers, theologians, and architects who helped promote a cultural renaissance of sorts. Yet for all his cultural and religious achievements, Henry remained a king whose political authority was continually questioned and undermined. He struggled to convert his personal ideals into effective statecraft, and this dissonance became increasingly evident as his reign progressed. Henry's early personal rule was thus marked by contradiction. He had the legal right to rule and the religious conviction to lead, but he lacked the political cohesion needed to consolidate power. His fallings out with key figures like Hubert de Burgh, his embrace of foreign courtiers, and his tendency to prioritize symbolic gestures over structural reforms left him vulnerable to criticism and dissent. He wanted to be a father to his people, a Christian king in the image of Edward the Confessor. But England needed more than spiritual symbolism. It needed governance, security, and order. By the mid-1240s, tensions between the crown and the nobility were once again threatening to erupt into open conflict. Many barons, frustrated by their lack of influence and by the king's missteps, began to call for reforms to limit royal power and restore the checks that Magna Carta had promised. Henry's inability or unwillingness to address these concerns set the stage for the later crisis that would culminate in the provisions of Oxford and the Second Barons' War. But in the years following his assumption of personal rule, it was already clear that Henry III was a monarch caught between the ideal of sacred kingship and the practical demands of medieval governance. In the end, the early part of Henry's reign was not one of consolidation, but of fragmentation. His authority was often more ceremonial than real, dependent on fluctuating alliances and an increasingly tenuous relationship with the nobility. Yet it was during this period that Henry's vision of kingship was most fully formed, a vision not of conquest and coercion, but of spiritual leadership, architectural grandeur, and a kingdom united under divine law. Whether that vision could withstand the realities of English politics remained an open question, one that would define the later chapters of his long and turbulent rule. Henry III of England, more than many of his predecessors or successors, stands out as a monarch whose reign was infused not only with religious symbolism, but with deeply personal and daily piety. He was not a king who wore faith as a mantle for political convenience. For Henry, religious devotion was the essence of kingship itself. From his youth to the final years of his reign, Henry's actions, his priorities, his constructions, his alliances, and even his conflicts were shaped by his spiritual convictions. His view of his role was as a servant of God first, and of the kingdom second. To him, the Church was not just an institution, but a divine partner in governance, an eternal guide for his soul and his monarchy. Henry's religiosity was not merely formal or ceremonial. His daily life was steeped in acts of devotion. He attended multiple masses a day, engaged in frequent private prayers, made generous donations to the church, and fasted more often than required. He read or listened to sacred scripture, sought spiritual counsel from confessors and monks, and saw suffering as an opportunity to draw closer to God. Observers of his time noted his reverence at the altar, his humility in prayer, and his genuine belief in the power of saints to intercede in worldly affairs. He was not a king who saw religion as a political weapon. Rather, he viewed the church as a higher order, one he was duty-bound to honor and protect. His sense of kingship, therefore, became a moral and religious mission, not just a legal or martial one. Of all the saints venerated in medieval England, none captured Henry's imagination and reverence more than Edward the Confessor. The 11th century king, canonized in 1161, was renowned for his piety, celibacy, and supposed miraculous healing powers. To Henry, Edward was not merely a saint but a royal model, an image of the sacred king he aspired to become. From a young age, Henry was drawn to Edward's life story and spiritual legacy. He believed that Edward, through his prayers and divine favor, watched over England and could intercede on behalf of its rulers. This admiration grew into a full-fledged spiritual obsession, culminating in Henry's decision to reconstruct Westminster Abbey not only as a grand place of worship, but as a shrine to the Confessor himself. This reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, which began in 1245, was perhaps the most visible and enduring expression of Henry's piety. Inspired by the Gothic cathedrals he had seen in France, particularly those in Reims and Chartres, Henry sought to build a house of God that would also stand as a symbol of the sanctity of the English monarchy. It was not just a project of architecture, but of devotion. The new Westminster would enshrine the relics of Edward the Confessor and present Henry's dynasty as heirs to a saintly royal lineage. Every stone, every sculpture, every window was meant to evoke divine grandeur. The Abbey's design incorporated French Gothic elements, but was suffused with English saintly symbolism. It was more than a cathedral, it was a holy testament, a statement of divine kingship, and a physical manifestation of Henry's religious identity. Beyond such grand gestures, Henry's support for the Church was both prolific and consistent. He was a prolific patron of religious houses, monasteries, nunneries, and friaries alike. Throughout his reign, he granted land, privileges, and financial gifts to monastic communities across the realm. He endowed hospitals, leper houses, and almshouses not only as acts of charity but as religious duty. His generosity to the mendicant orders, particularly the Dominicans and Franciscans, helped expand their influence in England. These orders, emphasizing poverty, preaching, and urban ministry, appealed to Henry's sense of pious simplicity. He supported them not only with funds, but also by attending their sermons and encouraging their presence at court. In ecclesiastical appointments, Henry often deferred to papal authority and spiritual qualifications rather than strictly political considerations. He valued religious integrity over administrative or military strength, which sometimes put him at odds with powerful nobles who sought to control such appointments for their own ends. At times, this led to friction, as in cases where Henry favored foreign clerics with papal approval over local candidates. Nevertheless, his choices reflected his belief that the Church should be led by men of proven piety, not mere political operators. His relationship with the papacy was one of deep respect, although not without tension, especially when the demands of Rome strained royal finance. Religion also played a central role in Henry's approach to diplomacy and foreign affairs. He saw himself as a Christian prince whose alliances and policies should serve not only the kingdom, but the wider Christendom. He contributed to crusading efforts, even if he never personally joined a crusade, and he viewed the protection of Christian holy sites as part of his royal duty. His financial support for the papacy's various campaigns, particularly in Sicily, was rooted in a belief that defending the interests of the Church was as important as defending English borders. This, however, often put him in political difficulty, especially when these commitments required unpopular taxation or borrowing. Henry's religious worldview extended into law and justice. He believed that kings ruled by divine mandate and were answerable to God for the moral welfare of their subjects. This belief informed his approach to kingship as one of shepherding rather than commanding. He often sought to reconcile rather than punish, to forgive rather than retaliate. He established religious feast days and holy observances, encouraged the building of parish churches, and intervened in legal cases involving clergy or church property to favor the Church's position. To critics, this made him a weak king, too pliant before clerical interests. But to Henry, it was proof of a conscience shaped by divine obligation. Even in the realm of royal finance, Henry's piety was evident. He often gave alms to the poor on saints' days, funded religious festivals and processions, and supported theological scholars at Oxford and Paris. He treated royal wealth as something to be redistributed in acts of devotion, a philosophy that endeared him to religious leaders but alienated many barons who believed the crown's resources should be directed toward defense and governance. His expenditures on religious ornamentation, relics, and shrines often exceeded those on military campaigns or castle building. While this focus added spiritual luster to his reign, it left his administration vulnerable to accusations of mismanagement and extravagance. Henry's devotion also influenced his personal relationships. He maintained close ties with confessors, monks, and abbots, many of whom acted as informal advisors and spiritual guides. His court, though politically turbulent, was also a place of theological discussion and religious culture. Liturgical music, illuminated manuscripts, and religious art flourished under his patronage. He encouraged religious drama and mystery plays, and he participated in public religious ceremonies with great humility. His marriage to Eleanor of Provence was solemnized with spiritual grandeur, and their children were raised in a court steeped in Christian learning and practice. Even his conflicts were often couched in religious terms. When he clashed with rebellious barons, he believed himself not just politically besieged, but spiritually tested. Yet for all his devoutness, Henry's religious policies were not universally praised. Critics accused him of favoring foreign clergy, of excessive generosity to church institutions, and of neglecting the secular needs of the realm. His efforts to enforce church law sometimes clashed with local customs or royal prerogatives. And his deep involvement in ecclesiastical affairs, while sincere, was often resented by those who saw it as weakness or distraction. The barons, in particular, viewed his piety as a convenient excuse for avoiding hard political decisions or for masking failures in military and administrative leadership. His emphasis on spiritual unity often came at the cost of political clarity. Nonetheless, the sincerity of Henry's faith is difficult to doubt. His actions, writings, and habits all point to a king who believed that salvation was more important than conquest, that charity was holier than power, and that a king's legacy should be judged by the church as much as by history. The grandeur of Westminster Abbey, the flourishing of monastic life, and the spiritual tone of his court all bear witness to a reign where piety was more than a virtue. It was the defining feature of kingship. In Henry's mind, the glory of God and the glory of the crown were not separate ambitions, but one and the same. Even in his later years, as rebellion and discontent grew, Henry never abandoned his religious identity. During the Second Barons' War, he prayed fervently for peace and forgiveness. In defeat and humiliation, he sought solace in confession and penance. He forgave those who rebelled against him, appealed to the papacy for support, and hoped that by aligning himself with the Church, he would be vindicated in the eyes of God if not in those of his peers. His devotion never wavered, even as his political fortunes rose and fell. Henry III's reign is thus a rare example of a king who placed faith above force, conscience above conquest. His devotion to Edward the Confessor, his building of Westminster Abbey, his patronage of monasticism, and his alignment with ecclesiastical authority all reflect a monarch who saw spiritual integrity as the heart of royal legitimacy. While this made him vulnerable in the rough world of medieval politics, it also set him apart in an age where kings were more often remembered for battles than for prayers. Henry may not have been a warrior king or a political genius, but he was, without doubt, one of the most genuinely devout rulers to ever sit on the English throne. The reign of Henry III offers a profound case study in how personal piety, institutional religion, and royal power were intertwined in the medieval imagination. For Henry, religion was not only a matter of private conscience, but a public and political enterprise. His reign was steeped in spiritual ambition, most clearly seen in his consistent and lavish support for the Church, his relationship with the papacy, his favoring of the new mendicant orders, and the careful crafting of his royal image into one of sanctity and divine favor. This vision of kingship was not merely symbolic. It informed daily governance, policy decisions, diplomatic initiatives, and even the king's legacy. From early in his reign, Henry maintained a close and respectful relationship with the papacy. He saw the Pope not just as the spiritual head of Christendom, but as a divine authority that legitimized and sanctified his own power. This belief made him unusually compliant with papal wishes, often to the frustration of his barons and counselors. When disputes arose between crown and church, Henry usually deferred to Rome. He viewed such submission not as weakness, but as an act of religious duty. Letters, envoys, and gifts flowed regularly from Henry's court to the Vatican, reinforcing bonds of obedience and spiritual kinship. He welcomed papal legates and allowed their authority within England, and in return, he received support in disputes and confirmation. Henry's willingness to accept papal decisions extended to sensitive areas such as ecclesiastical appointments. While English kings traditionally had a strong hand in selecting bishops and abbots, Henry often surrendered this power to the Pope or religious authorities. He appointed churchmen not for their political usefulness or loyalty to the crown, but for their perceived piety or their approval by Rome. This practice drew the ire of many English nobles who felt excluded from clerical patronage and who viewed foreign appointments as damaging to national sovereignty. Nevertheless, Henry considered these acts part of his divine obligation as a Christian monarch, to place spiritual integrity above political gain. His reverence for the Church also manifested in extraordinary generosity. Monasteries, abbeys, priories, and friaries all benefited from his largesse. Lands, privileges, exemptions from taxation, and building grants flowed continuously throughout his reign. Religious houses found in Henry a patron unmatched in zeal. He granted charters to dozens of foundations, endowing them with both wealth and freedom from secular interference. This support extended not only to long-established Benedictine and Cistercian orders, but also to the rapidly growing mendicant movements, especially the Franciscans and Dominicans. The Franciscans, with their message of radical poverty and humility, captivated Henry's imagination. Their founder, Francis of Assisi, had been canonized only shortly before Henry's accession, and his story of simplicity, obedience, and divine love appealed deeply to the king's spiritual temperament. Henry welcomed Franciscan friars into his realm, allowed them to establish houses in major cities, and regularly attended their sermons. He supported their ministries to the poor and encouraged their presence at court. Likewise, the Dominicans, known for their preaching and learning, found royal favor. They were instrumental in providing theological guidance and became trusted confessors and advisors. Henry saw both orders as essential to the moral renewal of Christendom and England. This embrace of mendicant orders, while admired by some, was not universally welcomed. Traditional monastic institutions occasionally resented the attention and resources redirected toward these newcomers. Moreover, some nobles viewed Henry's generosity as excessive and misguided, particularly when royal finances grew strained. The perception that the king lavished wealth on foreign or papally connected clerics while neglecting military or administrative needs became a common theme of discontent. Henry's piety, though personally sincere, often clashed with the practical demands of rule. His spiritual vision of kingship did not always align with the political or economic expectations of his realm. Even so, Henry remained steadfast. To him, giving to the Church was not optional. It was a sacred duty, a way to store up heavenly merit and ensure divine favor for himself and his dynasty. Religious donations, endowments, and privileges were seen as investments in eternal salvation and political legitimacy. In his mind, a pious king who supported the Church would be blessed by God and remembered with honor. Critics who challenged this idea were not merely opposing policy. They were, from Henry's perspective, endangering the soul of the nation. One of the most fascinating aspects of Henry's reign was how he consciously shaped his royal image into one of sanctity. He did not merely wish to be a good king. He aspired to be a holy one. Inspired by the cult of Edward the Confessor, he undertook an elaborate project to model himself on the Saint King. He believed that a monarch could serve not only as a temporal ruler, but also as a spiritual exemplar. This ambition drove his religious patronage, his moral conduct, and his efforts to align the crown with the Church in both appearance and substance. Central to this effort was the development of royal imagery that drew on Christian symbolism. Henry's official seals, coins, and public ceremonies increasingly depicted him not simply as a warrior or administrator, but as a figure of divine favor. He appeared in the robes of a penitent king, surrounded by religious motifs, and often in scenes of prayer or coronation under the hand of God. Art, architecture, and ritual were employed to elevate the monarchy to sacred status. The building of Westminster Abbey, with its intricate iconography and shrine to Edward the Confessor, was not only an act of devotion, but also a statement about the divine right and holy character of kingship itself. Henry's devotion to Edward the Confessor went beyond admiration. It bordered on emulation. He hoped to revive Edward's cult and use it as the spiritual foundation of his own reign. The reconstruction of Westminster Abbey was meant to house Edward's relics in splendor, attracting pilgrims and reinforcing the link between the Saint King and the current monarch. Henry invested heavily in beautifying Edward's tomb, commissioning gold, jewels, and intricate carvings that celebrated Edward's holiness. He celebrated Edward's feast days with pomp and piety, made offerings at his shrine, and spoke often of his desire to walk in the confessor's footsteps. So intense was Henry's devotion that he even petitioned for the canonization of Edward to be reaffirmed and elevated in prestige. This process, carefully guided through papal channels, was part of a larger strategy to present England as a holy kingdom under a saintly king. The Confessor's virtues, chastity, humility, mercy, were those that Henry wished to project onto himself. In portraying Edward as an ideal monarch, Henry indirectly offered himself as a contemporary embodiment of that ideal. This blending of history, sainthood, and propaganda created a narrative in which the king's political authority was inseparable from his religious identity. Henry's aspirations to sanctity were not merely symbolic. He adopted the practices of penance, charity, and pilgrimage with sincerity. He washed the feet of the poor on Maundy Thursday, gave alms on saints' days, and supported hospitals and leper houses. He listened to sermons regularly and often surrounded himself with religious advisors. Some chronicles of the time note his humility before God, his tears during Mass, and his concern for the salvation of his people. Whether or not he consciously saw himself as a candidate for future sainthood, he certainly conducted himself as if sainthood were an achievable goal for a king. This ambition extended to how Henry wished to be remembered. He planned his tomb within Westminster Abbey not only as a royal burial, but as a place of prayer and pilgrimage. He commissioned prayers for his soul and the souls of his ancestors. His legacy, he hoped, would not be one of conquest or administrative reform, but of spiritual stewardship. In the end, he wished to be judged not by historians or nobles, but by God. His kingship, therefore, was a sacred office, not merely a legal or military one. However, this self-fashioned sacred kingship had its drawbacks. In times of political turmoil, Henry's sanctified image could appear out of touch. When the barons rebelled, many saw his religious expenditures and ecclesiastical alliances as symbols of royal mismanagement rather than piety. His alignment with papal interests, foreign clerics, and unworldly priorities alienated those who wanted a more martial or practical monarch. To his critics, Henry's dream of a holy monarchy was not visionary but delusional, an escape from the realities of governance into a world of relics and rituals. Nonetheless, Henry's impact on the religious and symbolic culture of the English monarchy was profound. He set a precedent for later kings to incorporate sacred imagery and church patronage into their rule. Westminster Abbey, with its royal tombs and shrine to Edward, became the spiritual heart of the English monarchy for centuries. The idea that a king could be both a ruler and a holy figure, an anointed servant of God, took deeper root under Henry's long and devout reign. Even if his political decisions were often flawed, his spiritual vision endured. Henry III's reign cannot be fully understood without appreciating the central role of religion in shaping his actions, his alliances, his aspirations, and his legacy. His relationship with the papacy, his gifts to the church, his support for the mendicant orders, and his image as a sacred king all reflect a ruler who saw his crown not just as a symbol of power, but as a cross to bear. His piety was not a pose but a principle. He governed with his eyes fixed on heaven, even as the ground beneath his throne sometimes trembled with rebellion. And in doing so, he left behind not just a kingdom in political flux, but a spiritual imprint on the English monarchy that would echo for generations. In 1236, King Henry III of England married Eleanor of Provence, a union that would significantly influence the political and cultural landscape of his reign. Eleanor, born around 1223, was the daughter of Ramon Berenguer IV, Count of Provence, and Beatrice of Savoy. Their marriage was not only a personal alliance, but also a strategic move to strengthen ties between England and the influential regions of Provence and Savoy. Eleanor's arrival in England introduced a new cultural sophistication to the English court. She was well educated, with a deep appreciation for literature and the arts, and she brought with her a retinue of relatives and courtiers from Provence and Savoy. This influx of foreign influence, however, was met with suspicion and resentment by many English nobles, who viewed the newcomers as interlopers vying for royal favor and positions of power. Despite the initial tensions, Eleanor quickly established herself as a formidable presence in the English court. She was deeply involved in the political and religious life of the kingdom, often acting as an advisor to her husband and even serving as regent during his absence in 1253. Her influence extended to ecclesiastical appointments and the patronage of religious institutions, reflecting her own devout nature and commitment to the church. The royal couple had several children, the most notable being Edward, who would later ascend to the throne as Edward I. Eleanor was particularly devoted to Edward, overseeing his education and upbringing with great care. Their other children included Margaret, who married King Alexander III of Scotland, Beatrice, who became the Duchess of Brittany, Edmund, Earl of Lancaster, and Catherine, who died in childhood. Eleanor's familial connections extended beyond her immediate family. Her maternal uncles from Savoy, including Peter of Savoy and Boniface of Savoy, were granted significant positions and lands in England, further exacerbating tensions with the native nobility. Peter was made Earl of Richmond, and Boniface was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, appointments that were seen by many as favoritism towards foreigners. In addition to the Savoyards, Henry III half-brothers from the Lusignan family, his mother's children from her second marriage, were also brought to England and granted lands and titles. The Lusignans, originating from Poitou in France, were perceived as outsiders who were unduly favored by the king, leading to widespread discontent among the English barons. The accumulation of power and wealth by these foreign relatives strained the royal finances and fueled resentment among the English nobility. The barons were particularly aggrieved by the king's perceived neglect of their interests in favor of his foreign kin. This discontent culminated in the Provisions of Oxford in 1258, a set of reforms imposed by the barons to limit the king's authority and curtail the influence of his foreign relatives. Eleanor's unpopularity among the English populace was further exacerbated by her involvement in financial matters. She was known to be assertive in collecting the Queen Gold, a tax levied on fines and penalties, and her aggressive pursuit of these revenues made her a target of public ire. In 1263, during a period of heightened tension, Eleanor's barge was attacked by Londoners as she attempted to travel along the Thames, forcing her to seek refuge. The culmination of these tensions led to the Second Barons' War, a conflict between the king and a faction of rebellious barons led by Simon de Montfort. Eleanor's staunch support for her husband during this period was unwavering. She played a crucial role in raising funds and troops for the royalist cause, even traveling to France to garner support. Despite their efforts, the royal forces suffered a significant defeat at the Battle of Lewes in 1264, leading to the temporary capture of the king and his son Edward. Following the eventual royalist victory at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, where Simon de Montfort was killed, Eleanor's influence remained significant. She continued to be involved in the political and religious affairs of the kingdom, supporting her son's efforts to restore royal authority and stability. Eleanor's later years were marked by her dedication to her family and the church. She retired to Amesbury Priory, where she died in 1291. Eleanor of Provence's legacy is a complex one. Her marriage to Henry III brought cultural enrichment to the English court and strengthened international alliances. However, her influence and the favoritism shown to her foreign relatives contributed to significant political unrest and conflict. Despite these challenges, Eleanor's role as queen consort was marked by her unwavering support for her husband, her active participation in governance, and her commitment to her family's legacy. King Henry III's reign was marked by ambitious religious and architectural projects, such as the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, which significantly strained the royal finances. These endeavors, while reflecting his deep piety, required substantial funding, leading to increased taxation and borrowing. The financial burden was further exacerbated by Henry's acceptance of papal demands, notably his agreement to finance his son Edmund's claim to the Kingdom of Sicily, a venture that proved both costly and unsuccessful. To meet these obligations, Henry imposed heavy taxes, including levies on the clergy and nobility, which fueled widespread resentment among his subjects. Additionally, his attempts to reclaim lost Angevin territories in France, such as the failed 1230 campaign in Poitou, drained resources without yielding tangible gains. The king's financial mismanagement, characterized by favoritism towards foreign courtiers and a lack of fiscal restraint, eroded trust among the English barons and set the stage for political upheaval. In response to the mounting dissatisfaction, a group of barons, led by Simon de Montfort, compelled Henry to accept the Provisions of Oxford in 1258. These reforms aimed to limit royal authority by establishing a council of 15 barons to oversee governance and ensure adherence to the rule of law. While initially acquiescing, Henry later sought to undermine these provisions, leading to a breakdown in royal authority and escalating tensions. The king's resistance culminated in the Second Barons' War, during which de Montfort briefly seized control of the government. However, the The conflict ultimately ended with Henry's restoration to power, albeit with a diminished monarchy and a legacy of constitutional reform that would influence the future of English governance. The Second Barons' War, 1264 to 1267, was a pivotal conflict in English history, rooted in the escalating tensions between King Henry III and a faction of rebellious barons led by Simon de Montfort. The war was primarily fueled by dissatisfaction with Henry's autocratic rule, financial mismanagement, and favoritism towards foreign advisors. These issues culminated in a series of events that would temporarily shift the balance of power in England and lay the groundwork for future parliamentary governance. The barons' discontent had been simmering for years, exacerbated by Henry's repeated demands for funds to support his ambitious projects and military campaigns, including unsuccessful attempts to reclaim lost territories in France. In 1258, the barons compelled the king to accept the provisions of Oxford, which established a council of barons to oversee royal administration. However, Henry later repudiated these reforms, leading to a breakdown in trust and the eventual outbreak of civil war. Simon de Montfort emerged as the leader of the baronial opposition, advocating for a more accountable and representative form of governance. His leadership was instrumental in organizing resistance against the king and rallying support among the nobility and commoners alike. De Montfort's vision extended beyond mere opposition. He sought to implement systemic changes that would limit royal authority and involve a broader segment of society in decision-making processes. The conflict reached a critical point on May 14, 1264, at the Battle of Lewes in Sussex. De Montfort's forces achieved a decisive victory over the royal army, capturing both King Henry III and his son, Prince Edward. This triumph allowed de Montfort to assume control of the government, effectively becoming the de facto ruler of England. During his tenure, he summoned a parliament that included not only nobles and clergy but also commoners, marking a significant step towards a more inclusive political system. However, de Montfort's dominance was short-lived. In 1265, Prince Edward escaped captivity and rallied royalist forces to challenge the baronial regime. The ensuing confrontation occurred on August 4, 1265, at the Battle of Evesham. Edward's army decisively defeated de Montfort's forces, resulting in the death of de Montfort and many of his key supporters. This victory effectively ended the baronial rebellion and restored royal authority. Prince Edward's military prowess and strategic acumen were instrumental in re-establishing the monarchy's control. His actions during the conflict not only quelled the immediate rebellion, but also solidified his reputation as a capable leader. Following the war, Edward continued to play a central role in governing the kingdom and implementing reforms that addressed some of the grievances that had led to the uprising. The Second Barons' War had lasting implications for the English political landscape. While the immediate outcome favored the monarchy, the conflict underscored the necessity for a more balanced distribution of power between the crown and its subjects. The inclusion of commoners in de Montfort's parliament set a precedent for broader representation, influencing the development of the English parliamentary system in the centuries to follow. The Second Barons' War was a significant chapter in England's journey towards constitutional governance. The clash between royal authority and baronial reformers highlighted the challenges of balancing power and the importance of inclusive political structures. Although the rebellion was ultimately suppressed, the ideals it championed continued to resonate, shaping the evolution of English democracy. King Henry III's reign is indelibly linked to the transformation of Westminster Abbey into a monumental expression of piety and royal authority. His architectural vision, centered around the veneration of Edward the Confessor, not only redefined the English Gothic style, but also solidified the Abbey's role as a symbol of dynastic legitimacy and spiritual devotion. Initiated in 1245, Henry's reconstruction of Westminster Abbey was inspired by the Gothic cathedrals of France, particularly the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. He envisioned a structure that would surpass its continental counterparts in grandeur and sanctity. The resulting design featured pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and an emphasis on verticality, creating an ethereal atmosphere intended to evoke the divine. This architectural endeavor was not merely aesthetic. It was a deliberate attempt to manifest the king's spiritual aspirations and to establish a lasting legacy. Central to this vision was the shrine of Edward the Confessor, whom Henry revered as a model of Christian kingship. The shrine, adorned with intricate cosmedy mosaics crafted by Italian artisans, served as the spiritual heart of the abbey. By situating Edward's tomb at the focal point of the church, Henry sought to draw a direct line between his own reign and the sanctity of his predecessor, thereby reinforcing his divine right to rule. The abbey's artistic and cultural significance extended beyond its architecture. It became a repository of sacred art and a center for religious ceremonies, including royal coronations and funerals. The inclusion of elaborate tombs and effigies, such as Henry's own, further emphasized the intertwining of monarchy and faith. These elements collectively transformed Westminster Abbey into a symbol of national identity and religious devotion. Henry's burial in the abbey, near the shrine of Edward the Confessor, was a culmination of his lifelong dedication to intertwining his legacy with that of the saint. His tomb, later enhanced by his son Edward I, featured a bronze effigy and elaborate decorations, reflecting both his royal status and spiritual aspirations. This final resting place served as a testament to his enduring influence on the religious and political landscape of England. Contemporary and historical assessments of Henry III's reign present a complex portrait of a monarch whose piety was both a defining virtue and a potential liability. His deep religious devotion manifested in generous patronage of the church and ambitious architectural projects. However, critics argue that his focus on spiritual matters often came at the expense of effective governance. His reliance on foreign advisors and perceived favoritism led to political unrest, culminating in the Provisions of Oxford and the subsequent baronial revolts. The contrast between Henry's religious devotion and political inefficacy raises questions about the role of piety in leadership. While his spiritual commitments inspired monumental achievements like Westminster Abbey, they also contributed to administrative challenges and strained relations with the nobility. This dichotomy illustrates the complexities of balancing personal convictions with the practical demands of rulership. Ultimately, Henry III's piety can be viewed as both a virtue and a liability. It fostered cultural and religious advancements that left a lasting impact on England's heritage. Yet it also exposed vulnerabilities in his political acumen, leading to periods of instability. His reign serves as a case study in the interplay between faith and governance, highlighting the challenges faced by leaders who seek to harmonize personal devotion with public duty. King Henry III of England, who reigned from 1216 to 1272, left behind a legacy that profoundly influenced the trajectory of the English monarchy. His reign, characterized by a blend of devout piety and political challenges, set the stage for significant constitutional developments and reshaped the nation's religious and architectural landscape. Henry's deep religious devotion was a defining feature of his reign. His most enduring contribution to England's architectural heritage is the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey. Initiated in 1245, this ambitious project aimed to honor Saint Edward the Confessor, the patron saint of England, and to establish a lasting symbol of the monarchy's divine right to rule. The abbey's design, inspired by French Gothic cathedrals, featured soaring arches, intricate stained glass windows, and the renowned cosmotesque mosaics. These elements not only enhanced the abbey's aesthetic appeal, but also underscored the sanctity of the English crown. The abbey became a focal point for royal ceremonies, including coronations and burials, reinforcing the monarchy's spiritual authority. In addition to his architectural endeavors, Henry's reign was marked by significant political developments. The Provisions of Oxford, enacted in 1258, represented a pivotal moment in English constitutional history. These reforms, accepted by Henry under pressure from his barons, aimed to limit royal authority and establish a council of barons to oversee governance. While the provisions were short-lived, they set a precedent for future constitutional reforms and highlighted the growing influence of the baronial class in shaping national policy. Despite his religious fervor and architectural achievements, Henry's political acumen was often questioned. His reliance on foreign advisors and perceived favoritism towards certain factions led to tensions with the English barons. These strains culminated in the Second Barons' War, 1264 to 1267, a civil conflict that further tested the limits of royal authority. Although Henry ultimately retained the throne, the war underscored the necessity for a more balanced distribution of power between the monarchy and its subjects. Henry's reign also laid the groundwork for the development of constitutional monarchy in England. The Magna Carta, signed in 1215 by his father, King John, had established the principle that the monarch was subject to the law. Henry's acceptance of the Provisions of Oxford and subsequent political reforms furthered this concept, moving England closer to a system where the king's powers were constrained by legal and institutional frameworks. King Henry III's legacy is multifaceted. His contributions to England's religious and architectural heritage are evident in the enduring presence of Westminster Abbey. Politically, his reign highlighted the tensions between royal authority and baronial power, setting the stage for future constitutional developments. While his deep piety may have been perceived as a weakness by some, it also provided a moral foundation for his reign and influenced the cultural and spiritual life of the nation. Henry III's reign, though fraught with challenges, was instrumental in shaping the evolution of the English monarchy and the nation's constitutional landscape.